Dumbass. Speaking with the man's voice forbade the madness of the prophet. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. This week's parasha is Numbers chapter 22 through chapter 25, verse 9. I believe. Let's see. That's correct. In this week's parasha, Parashat Balak, we find the origin of that great American phrase, dumbass. That's right. You find it in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. American cuss words originating from the Bible. Anyway, this week's parasha has some quite significant philosophical or theological concepts conveyed in it. Of course, you have the famous story of Bilam's donkey speaking to him. And this is an example of one of many places, but perhaps one of the most visual and memorable examples of things that perplex a lot of people, and especially more rational people, especially people in our generation. And so I think it's important to talk about it. To talk about it brings up one of the verses which I think is most fundamental in the Torah, and which can be understood as a key to understanding many difficult passages in the Torah. That passage is in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, the same book of Numbers that this week's parasha is in. So Numbers chapter 12, verse 6. It says, وَيَوْمَرْ شِمْعُونَ ذَبُورَيْ إِمْ إِهِيَ نَبِي أَخَمْ أَذْنُوي بَمَّرْأَ أذنوي بمرأة إلو إثوادو بحلوم ذا برب لخن عبدي موشى بخول بثي نأمانه. So it says in Hebrew, and he said, listen now to my words. If there will be among you a prophet, in a vision to him, in a vision of Adonai, to him will I be known. In a dream I shall speak to him. But not so Moses my servant, b'chol bethi na'amonhu. In all my house he is most faithful. So, of all the prophets of God, with all their accounts of interacting with the Lord, with Adonai, with miraculous visions and such, the Torah is telling us quite explicitly, if I will speak to a prophet, it will be in a vision or in a dream, but not so with my servant Moses. Verse 8, mouth to mouth I will speak to him, as opposed to through some sort of intermediary of an angel. And not with perplexing riddles or perplexing allegories. And he shall look upon, figuratively, upon the Lord to the extent that his mind can conceive. So then why do you not fear to speak in such a way about Moses, my servant? So this verse is a key to understanding many, many passages in the remainder of the Torah. And this is the reason, though many people criticize Moshe ben Maimonides, many people criticize him for understanding various passages that seem to anthropomorphize God, that seem to relate God as being physical in some way, or being a human in some way. They criticize Maimonides as saying that these things are in visions. But Maimonides says this based on this rather clear verse that is distinguishing Moses from all the other prophets. Quite explicitly says that if there's a prophet among you, I will speak to him in a vision or in a dream, both of which are visions. A dream is just a vision when someone's sleeping, and a vision, as opposed to a dream, is basically when somebody is essentially dreaming when they were awake and suddenly they're like in a dreamlike state. In other words, it's not physical reality. Not so Moses. Verse 8, it says, most Christian translations, they're translated face to face to anthropomorphize it. But the word here isn't even face, though if it did say face, it still wouldn't be a problem. But the word there is not face, it's pe el pe, mouth to mouth. The idea is without the intermediary function of angels through whom God is speaking, but rather God is speaking to Moses directly without an intermediary. The only intermediary being the cognitive faculties of Moses himself. So, back to this week's Parashat Balak, and the interaction of the donkey with Bilaam, the prophet of the idolatrous nations of Balak. So, one of the more biblically consistent ways of understanding that may seem like a stretch to someone if they disregard this passage in Numbers chapter 12 that we just read about the difference between the prophecy of Moses as opposed to other prophets. But having that in mind, and also having in mind the passage in Hosea where God explicitly states that he speaks to prophets through allegory, I think that one of the more logical understandings of the interaction between the prophet of idolaters Bilaam and the donkey who spoke to him, as well as the angel of the Lord in that narrative, is that this all happened in a vision. And the donkey speaking to him, it's not that the donkey suddenly was speaking as a human speaks, but rather that in a vision Bilaam perceived utterance from the donkey. But it's not that the donkey was literally speaking, but rather it was all occurring in Bilaam's own mind. And essentially the angel was using the donkey to introduce himself to Bilaam in the vision. And then afterwards it became apparent to Bilaam that it's not merely the donkey speaking to him, but it's the angel of the Lord. And that's in a nutshell. And one other little nugget from this week's parasha, we find, though most translations translate it as Balak sending messengers to Bilaam, but in the Hebrew it says malachim, which is the same exact term which is translated elsewhere as angels, which also indicates that the term usually translated as angel, malach, does not necessarily mean a supernatural being of some sort from another dimension. They can also be a human being, just as you also have in the book of Genesis where Esav sent angels to Jacob. On that note, wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, and those are your nuggets for this week's Parashat Balak. Shabbat Shalom, ويسم لكم Shalom. Yalla bye.